Good evening, and thank you for joining the Benjy Brooks APSASode tonight on gender equity in pediatric surgery. My name is Marion Henry, and I had the pleasure of serving as the chair of the Benjy Brooks Committee from its inception in 2019 until last month. My co-moderator tonight is Dr. Erin Perrone, who has taken over as the chair of the Benjy Brooks Committee. The Benjy Brooks Committee is the Women in Surgery Committee of the American Pediatric Surgical Association. For many years, women in pediatric surgery gathered at a luncheon at the annual meeting, initially on their own, and finally as a recognized gathering of APSA back in the early 2000s. In order to fully bring forth issues of concerns to women pediatric surgeons to the APSA community, the committee was officially formed in 2019 at the 50th anniversary meeting. We look forward to hopefully gathering in person again at the next annual meeting in May of 2022 in San Diego. As of right now, the Benjy Brooks Luncheon is scheduled to be held on Friday during that meeting. Last year, I had the privilege of giving a talk at the surgical section of the AAP on gender equity in pediatric surgery. Some of the data that I found showed that while we are approaching equal numbers of female and male pediatric surgery trainees, we still have significant gaps in the leadership ranks. Additionally, women do not publish as much and are not as represented on editorial boards of our main pediatric surgery journals. Uncovering these challenges led to the proposal for our Benjy Brooks session on gender disparities in pediatric surgery and how to advance careers of women pediatric surgeons. Each year, the Career Advancement and Leadership Skills for Women in Healthcare course, under the direction of Julie Silver, launches a new strategic initiative at supporting women in healthcare. She is joined by the American Medical Women's Association and the Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine program in these campaigns. Last year, the initiative was Her Time Is Now, and it was focused on gender equity in the workplace, which was part of this call to action in pediatric surgery. This year's initiative is Give Her a Reason to Stay in Healthcare. It is a call to action for businesses, organizations, healthcare institutions, and individuals to find and act on specific ways to support women in medicine at this critical time, especially as we've seen a large exodus of women from healthcare fields during this COVID pandemic. Our APSASode today features 3 outstanding women pediatric surgeons who will be discussing some challenges in gender equity in pediatric surgery and offering suggestions and solutions as to how we can help and retain our talented women in pediatric surgeon and give her a reason to stay. Dr. Cassandra Kelleher will lead off with discussing employment equity in women surgeons. Dr. Kelleher is an assistant professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School and the surgical director of the fetal care program in the neonatal intensive care unit of the Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. With over 40 publications, her research focuses on surgical appropriateness and equity in surgery. She has become an expert in surgical inequities in the workforce and will be speaking on the underemployment of women surgeons. Dr. Mary Fallett will be discussing challenges in funding opportunities and editorial positions. Dr. Fallett is professor of surgery at the University of Louisville and the director of surgical quality at Norton's Children's Hospital, where she has been in practice for 33 years. Dr. Fallett has a long history of service and leadership in pediatric surgery. Currently, she is the vice chair of the Children's Surgical Verification Committee for the ACS Optimal Resources for Children's Surgical Care Program and a member of the ACGME Surgery Residency Review Committee. She has been continuously funded by HRSA as a program director for the Kentucky EMS for Children's program since 1993 and has just been awarded an HRSA grant as one of 5 sub-PIs to assist with developing a regional children's pandemic network. Finally, Dr. Diana Farmer will share her thoughts on how we can help advance women through the pipeline and achieve equity in our ranks. Dr. Farmer is the distinguished professor and Pearl Stamp Stewart Endowed Chair of the UC Davis Department of Surgery, Surgeon-in-Chief of the UC Davis Children's Hospital, and Chief of Pediatric Surgery at the Shriners Hospital, Northern California. Dr. Farmer is widely known for her role as principal investigator in an NIH-funded management of myelomeningocele study. Dr. Farmer received FDA approval for her first in-human clinical trial of stem cells in fetal surgery for myelomeningocele. She has been honored with numerous awards through her career, included being a Luce Scholar, a member of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, a member of the esteemed National Academy of Sciences. She is past president of the American Pediatric Surgical Association, past chair of the Board of Governors of the American College of Surgeons, past chair of the Society of Surgical Chairs, and founding president of the Global Initiative for Children's Surgery. Dr. Kelleher, I will turn over the screen to you.
Thank you. So I'm so very honored to be invited to speak tonight. I am going to talk specifically about employment of female surgeons and the equity, or rather inequity, in the work that we do every day. There are many things that female surgeons do that are different than our male colleagues. One is to take on more uncompensated committee and administrative work. We have also been shown to spend more time with patients on things like decision-making, considering cultural considerations in care, and involving family members in patients' care. And there's some data to suggest that female surgeons choose subspecialties in different proportions than male surgeons. The thing that I'm going to focus on today, though, is not these parts of our everyday work, but really on the clinical work that we do, and discuss how female surgeons are underemployed compared to male surgeons in our clinical work. A lot of you may be thinking that underemployment means that we're not working enough hours. And clearly, I'm not saying that any of us are not working enough hours, because we know that that's not true. But there is a different kind of underemployment, so-called silent underemployment, or this kind of underemployment. And we know that these people are working at jobs that are inadequate with respect to their skill, education, or experience level. And this is the kind of underemployment that we see in female surgeons. There are many reasons that people have given that female surgeons may work differently or have underemployment when compared to male surgeons. And these are because maybe women are less available. They may be spending time taking care of family or doing other kinds of tasks in the hospital, like administrative work or committee work. They may be doing less complex cases because they choose to do less complex cases or work in hospitals that have a less complex case mix. Or maybe it's just that female surgeons choose less complex specialties, and it's not that they're doing less complex cases when compared to their male peers, they're just in less complex specialties, and we're comparing apples to oranges, like breast surgery to cardiac surgery. And I'm going to go through these and tell you why it's not the case. These are not actual reasons for female surgeon inequities or underemployment. It's rationalizations that this underemployment is based on actual systemic differences in our work and the way we get our work. So first, let's address availability. One thing that we hear quite often is that females are not accessible, or that we're not available, that we're not working as often as our male colleagues. So we have done some investigation into this, looking at the surgeons at Massachusetts General Hospital. And much of the data I'm going to give you during this talk has been our own data from Mass General, but there are some other areas of data collected in this talk that I'll share with you also. So this data from Mass General shows that the percentage of males and females in the workforce, how often they're available to operate, and how often they did operative cases. So the percentage of operative cases that they did. And here we see that male surgeons are 80% of the workforce here at Mass General. They are available to operate 80% of the time out of the total availability of surgeons, and they do about 80% of the operative cases. And we can see that females, just like males, are 20% of the workforce, available the same number of operative months as our percentage in the workforce, and we do the same number of operative cases here at Mass General. So given our proportion in the workforce, we are actually equally as available as our male colleagues. Furthermore, we looked at whether females maybe were taking time off or decreasing their workload after maternity leave. And if we looked at the percentage of annual volume divided by months for 6 months before maternity leave, which is designated as X on the X-axis, and 6 months after maternity leave, what we find is that female surgeons in the light blue line after maternity leave actually returned to the same clinical volume as they did prior to maternity leave within a few months of leave. When we compare to other kinds of leave that males or females take, such as leave for their own health care, leave to care for other family members, sabbatical, military commitment, we find that the maternity leave volume pre and post mirrors that of other types of leaves. It doesn't seem then like women are taking time off to raise families and decreasing the amount of clinical work they do. What we also find is that women actually do a large percentage of the case volume when it's presented to them. So we looked over the total population of pediatric surgeons in the state of New York and found that in early career, females did a larger proportion of the cases that were available to their entire surgical network. So all of their peer surgeons whom they worked with, they did a higher percentage of those cases. And this persisted into the late career, even though it lost statistical significance. So it wasn't that they weren't working, they were actually doing more cases proportionally to their male colleagues. Sorry, I skipped a few slides there. So I think that I've shown you that women surgeons seem to be as available as their male colleagues and that they are willing to work or do a higher proportion of cases that are presented to them. And so I think that this rationalization can be put to sleep now that we have looked at the data. Next, let's talk about case complexity and subspecialty choice, because a lot of people say like women are choosing different subspecialties at different proportions, and that's the reason that they have a underemployment. But when we actually look across subspecialties, we find that it doesn't really matter what subspecialty you choose, that if we look at the RVUs per case at Mass General, there's several subspecialties in which there are male and female surgeons, that the RVU per case favors male surgeons in nearly every subspecialty that we looked at. So it's not because women are choosing a specific subspecialty, it's within the specialties themselves that we see a different complexity of cases. When Altieri looked across the state of New York at all general surgeons, they found a similar phenomenon, that when they looked at the percentage of female surgeons who were operating in the top 25% of case volumes, in nearly every subspecialty they examined, women were a very small proportion of those surgeons operating with the highest case volumes. The only one where women were equal to men was in breast surgery. Additionally, we found that in Canada, NOSA et al. Examined the remuneration per hour that women surgeons were getting. So Canada has a fee for service system just like the United States, and about 20% of women in surgeons in Canada are women. And what they found was that at the lowest remuneration cases per hour, women did a disproportionately higher volume of those cases. And when it came to those cases where there was a high earning per hour, women did a disproportionately lower volume of those cases than their male colleagues. And so what it actually seems is that regardless of specialty and across many different genres, women are doing cases that have a lower RVU or lower remuneration. So why are these things happening is the question. And really, is this something that we can get at just by saying that women are making these choices, or are there system level inequities that lead to these imbalances? And some of the things that we've found when we've looked into this more deeply is that women seem to work in smaller networks of surgeons altogether. So if we look at every female surgeon, pediatric surgeon in New York, we took all of their colleagues and grouped them together. So whether they work at an academic hospital or at several hospitals that are in the community, or if they work at a community hospital alone, we took all of their colleagues and said, how many people do we actually work with? How many colleagues do we have? And females have a significantly smaller number of colleagues. So maybe they're going to smaller hospitals when they take work outside of the academic institution. And when we looked at the total case volumes of those groups of people, we found that females actually work in smaller practices altogether. So they have a lower total case volume. Maybe that has something to do with the reason that their RVUs are smaller is because maybe at those peripheral hospitals, they're not doing as big of cases. Interestingly enough, in the state of New York, female pediatric surgeons work at academic institutions equally as often as male surgeons do. And if you remember the data I just showed you from Altieri, they found a similar phenomenon that women chose to work in academia equally as often as males. So they weren't choosing specifically to work in peripheral hospitals or community hospitals that may have a less academic focus. The other thing that we find is that female surgeons seem to receive fewer new patient referrals. And this is, again, data from Mass General. And we looked at those new patient referrals to female surgeons. And surgeons are a little different than a lot of other subspecialties in that almost all of our all of our operative volume comes from new patient referrals or sometimes emergency care. But if we looked across seniority, so for people on the left graph, less than 10 years in practice, 10 to 20 years in practice, or more than 20 years in practice, we found that in the yellow circles, which represent male surgeons, female surgeons in the red circles had fewer new patient referrals per month than their male colleagues. And sort of just something that was discouraging, we found that over time, over 20 years, there was really not a lot of difference in the referrals to female surgeons. So if we look by decade in the right graph. Another thing that is a little discouraging is that women surgeons have an oversized effect on their referral patterns if they have a bad outcome. So this is some interesting data from Heather Sarson, who showed that if we look at the graph on the left, that quarterly referrals to female surgeons in the red triangles actually go down after an episode where a patient dies. So at time 0, the female surgeon referrals started to go down and stayed down for a prolonged period of time, 6 quarters. Whereas if male surgeons encountered a death in the blue circles, they continued to accrue the same or higher referrals from those referring physicians. In addition, and not only that, but if at time 0 there's a death again, those female surgeons' colleagues, other female surgeons in the same specialty, also saw a decrement in the number of referrals that they received from those referring providers, whereas males did not see any decrement in their referral pattern over time. So a bad outcome didn't only affect the female surgeon who's had that outcome, it affected her female surgical colleagues within the same specialty. And last but not least, maybe surprising or not, female surgeons have less OR block time than their male colleagues. So in this article that was published in the Peri-Op journal, they actually surveyed many operating rooms across the country and found that female surgeons have about 2 hours less time per month allocated to their OR block time. And that female surgeons were much more likely to have insufficient OR block time compared to their operative workloads than their male colleagues. So what I think I've shown you over the last 10 minutes is that female surgeons seem to have underemployment. And this is our trying to find employment equity, and our strive for employment equity is really hampered by systemic barriers and unequal opportunities in our workplace. And so I think if these obstacles persist, in the words of Janet Yellen, we're going to squander the potential of our female surgeons and incur substantial loss, not only in productivity, but in increased burnout and early attrition of our female surgeons. So I have many people to thank for this data, which we've been working on for the last several years. I'm going to put their names up really quickly because I want to leave you with one last thought, which is I think that we're all striving for the same thing here, all of us here on this talk and our colleagues in surgery, female and male. And that's not to give women or other people who have underemployment, minorities, immigrants, foreign medical graduates. We don't want to put them first. We don't want to put them second. What we really want is to give them freedom, to give them equal opportunity so that they can take their place, whatever they decide that it should be, that it's not squandered or squashed by norms and systematic inequalities that are keeping us where we are now. I'm going to stop sharing and say, I think it's time.
Thank you, Dr. Kelleher. Dr. Fallett, we'll turn the screen over to you at this point.
So I'm going to take you through a quick trip of gender inequities in editorial boards and research. And some of these slides are pretty busy, but I will make them available to you afterwards. So first, I wanted to remind everybody about the definitions. Editor-in-chief is the lead editor or chief editor of a publication. An associate editor manages peer review of manuscripts, and sometimes there are many associate editors for a journal. Editorial board members are individuals who commit in advance to provide a certain number of reviews for a journal annually. And an editorial consultant is usually somebody who is a senior freelancer who plays an advisory role or is an expert in a particular area and is paid for their services by a journal. So I have a couple of articles in this section. The first, and they're all recent. The first from 2021 looks specifically at gender distribution among surgical journal editorial boards for women surgical scientists. And it analyzed the top 50 ranked US surgical journals in 2019. Of interest, only 42 of them listed the required information to be included in the study. And the proportion of women on editorial boards was very similar to the proportion of women practicing surgery in 2017. On the right in the figure, you can see that editorial board members accounted for nearly 15%, associate editors nearly 15%, and editor-in-chief only 5%. So significantly smaller number than men. These are the proportion of editorial board members on the left and associate editors on the right by surgical journal. I'm going to highlight a few. For example, I'm really proud of the American Journal of Surgery, which has editorial board members accounting for 30% of their board. And you can see that they're over here also up here, and as women associate editors account for about 65%. The other journals to highlight are Journal of Neurosurgery, Journal of Surgical Education, Annals of Surgery, Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. Nevertheless, although they are in the higher percentage for having women on their editorial boards, you can see that we still only account at the most for 30%. For associate editors, the ratio is a little bit higher, going from 50 to 60% for some of these journals. For example, JAMA Surgery, Annals of Surgery, Journal of Surgical Education. Some of these journals are a little bit higher in their percentages. Next, looked at gender inequalities for pediatric specific journals. And this study looked at all countries, and it was 125 journals in total. And I tried to highlight on this slide those that would be of interest to our audience. So here at the top, you see editorial board members, and here you see editors-in-chief. Women numbers, percent women, men numbers, percent men, total for both. And then this is editors-in-chief. So you can see there are a couple that have an editor-in-chief who's female, and the rest are all male. So our Journal of Pediatric and Adolescent Gynecology currently has a woman at the helm. And anesthesia, and also has a large percentage of editorial board members that are women. Makes sense. It's a gynecologic female slanted specialty. Pediatric anesthesia, about a third are women. Journal of Pediatric Surgery, we are pretty low, and I'm going to send this to Dr. Holcomb so we can have a look at it. Pediatric Surgery International, similarly low. Pediatric Transplantation, low, although they do have a female editor-in-chief, 1 out of 2. Seminars in Pediatric Surgery, not available. European Journal of Pediatric Surgery only has 4 total, and none are women. JAMA Peds, on the other hand, in pediatrics, have a pretty high percentage of women. And then if you look at these by specialty, here we are, pediatric surgery, we have 4 journals that they looked at internationally, and 20 of the editorial board members were women, 95 were men, and only 1 editor-in-chief was a woman. So again, pretty low percentages. When you compare participation of women and men per country, however, we are the highest ratio of women, so 38.33% by geographic areas. And then the last looked at international general surgery journals. This looked at the top 25, but there were 28 unique journals that they used in this study. And the blue bars are female, orange is male. And looking at the top, you can see editors-in-chief, deputy positions, editorial board positions, non-academic positions, which would be staff, so higher percentage of women, honorary founding positions, administrative positions. So the worker bees are the women, but the women who are in the more leadership positions for these journals are in the minority. Then looking at research, I picked out a couple of studies that are fairly recent. However, a lot of the data is not particularly recent. For those of you who aren't familiar with this acronym, STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This was a study that was commissioned by the General Accountability Office, looking at Title IX compliance with our funding agencies at the federal level. You can see in fiscal year 2014 that universities received nearly $25 billion in federal grant funding. So this looked at the specific federal agencies that were funding and whether men and women were equivalent. They looked at 6 different agencies and found that the NIH, the National Science Foundation, and USDA all had no evidence of disparities. They did find disparities in the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and NASA. When they went to these agencies, there was some dispute on the part of the agencies. The GAO maintained that they needed to look at their funding initiatives and potential biases, although again, some of these agencies refuted that there was any bias. And then this was a study published in JAMA in 2019. Some of you may know Teresa Woodruff. She's a researcher at Northwestern University and was one of the primary individuals who authored this. They compared NIH grant amounts to first-time male and female principal investigators, and they looked at years 2006 to 2017, so it spanned many years. At the left are all the different grant types that are funded by the federal government. And then you can see the number of grants and the percent of female PIs. So for all grant types, it was nearly half. And some of them, you can see, had a little bit higher percentages. And then it looked at total funds for male versus female, median funds, and the median difference. And you'll notice that for women, there were a couple of granting agencies like the R01 grants, where women had a little bit of an edge in terms of funding, but for the most part, they were funded less for equivalent grants. And the conclusions of this study were that the female PIs at Big 10 universities received a median of 66,000 versus 148,000 for male PIs, so pretty significant difference. Women at Ivy League universities received statistically significant smaller grant amounts by about 20,000, and that at the top 50 NIH-funded institution, first-time female awardees received significantly smaller grant amounts by nearly 35,000. Other conclusions for first-time PIs across all grant types and institutions, women received a median of 126,000 versus 165,000 for men. For the 10 highest funded grant types across all institutions, first-time females received a median award of about 10,000 or so less, with the largest differences in N01 and U01 grants. However, for R01 grants, for some reason, we received about 16,000 more than men. And so putting all this together, it seems like there are some barriers of interest. The AAMC physician specialty data in 2019 versus 2017 showed a modest increase in the numbers of women going into general surgery, but you can see we're still really in a low percentage compared to our male counterparts. In the true number of women and men who apply for editorial positions is really unknown. Similarly, the number of women who apply for grants is a little bit less and more proportionate to the number of women who are in science and medicine now. The roadblocks might be perceptions of surgical lifestyle, lack of mentorship, implicit gender biases, unequal pay, lingering stigma of familial priorities, and women surgical residents are more likely than male counterparts to report symptoms of burnout. Some of the remedies might be establishment of clear editorial board member selection criteria that would make it more realistic for women to apply and to appreciate what the criteria are. Implementation of mentorship programs by prominent surgical societies. I was just the past vice president of the AAST. There is a new editor-in-chief for the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, and he has not only selected several women to be his editorial assistants, he is implementing a directed mentorship program for individuals to become good journal reviewers. Journal facilitated pipeline programs is another initiative. And I think that's all I have. So I will yield now to Diana, and then we'll have some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Follett. Dr. Farmer, the screen share should be yours.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this incredibly interesting and provocative, I would say, conversation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disparities along the pipeline and what can we do to help promote and advance women in pediatric surgery. So just to give a little history of women in surgery, because that's how we all start as pediatric surgeons. The first doctor, I think everyone knows this story, to be granted an MD in the United States was Elizabeth Blackwell. The first female surgeon was Mary Edwards Walker, and I think people know the story that she actually started her career disguised a bit as a man in order to break into this field. First African-American female physician was Rebecca Lee Crumpler, and the first female dean was also in the 1800s, Anne Preston. So what does the pipeline look today? We obviously got a good start, but there seems to have been a little bit of a fall off. If you look right now, the women in general surgery is now 43% of the total, whereas in pediatric surgery, it's actually interesting to see that we are now up to 54% of the total, which actually surprised me when I looked at these data. So we've got a pipeline in place now that is starting to look like the percentage of physicians here. It's an interesting question to ask whether, and some have raised that question, whether pediatric surgery is more attractive to women surgeons, the way pediatricians seem to be dominated more by women now. It's just an interesting observation, and that's very different from 30 years ago when there were only a few women pediatric surgeons and over 90% were male. But let's look at a minute for what are some of the challenges to career advancement. Some of my colleagues have expressed some of the same interest and points in their talks. There are barriers that have been consistently reported: lack of supportive supervisors, exclusion from sort of the informal networks, lack of senior role models, inhospitable cultures and that unconscious bias, the need to prioritize family over work. When you ask men the same questions, their answers are slightly different. What do they see as barriers to career advancement? Unwillingness to change organizations or companies may be actually a different twist on the issue of prioritizing family. They may have similar roots, and having ineffective leadership styles come up for them. So 4 key barriers, I think, have to do with just an underlying prejudice that exists in our society today. Why does it appear that men seem to be promoted more quickly than women with equivalent qualifications? Is it still wanting to just have people who look like us in the club? Is there a real resistance to women leadership? The sense is, it's often said that everybody likes women to be junior residents. We show up and we do the work. They're not so sure they want to work for a female boss. And do women have different, again, leadership styles and demands in family life? This takes one to, the sponsorship imperative that women don't need to be fixed. We need to fix the system. We need to address these unconscious biases, and we need to be sponsors and have sponsors for the advancement, for public representation of people, as was mentioned earlier. Sponsors, they say, stick their neck out. They point to someone and say, hey, take this person. Whereas mentors tend to be more behind the scenes operators. I kind of like that analogy and that explanation. I like this quote on leadership. It's the process of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and the motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. I personally think women are very well suited for leadership roles. So what are some of the important characteristics of a leader? Interpersonal skills, relationship maintenance. Again, I think many women come by these skills naturally. Communication skills, being a good listener as well as a good speaker. Values, respecting a group without favoritism. Organizational consciousness, breaking a barrier to achieve a goal. Confidence, adopting a measured approach while under pressure. Creativity, and achieving results. Again, all things that I think women are very well suited to do. But when you do some surveys on what are certain leadership competencies, you can see in the green, these are competencies that women tend to score higher in, whereas the black are ones that women tend to score less well in, although it's pretty darn close. And the yellow are sort of tied. So in fact, women do well in the objective measures when they are undertaken of leadership competencies. So what are some practical tips? So here's a few. Lead yourself first. You have to lead yourself and control yourself before you can lead others. Work on your interpersonal and communication skills. Organization and priority setting skills. It's often true that women get pulled in many directions, and I think Marion talked about that in her presentation early. We tend to sign up for lots of administrative work. Prioritizing the things that are key to your job now or your organization. Disarm the tenure clock if you need to, and use collaborators. When issues come up, don't make them personal. Be dispassionate to solve the problems. Promote, support your junior colleagues. Develop your administrative skills. Keep your CV up to date. Have a ready-to-go executive summary, which is a little bit different than the typical academic CV for when other jobs come along. Read outside of surgery. Julie Freschlag is a great example of this. She always reads leadership books, things like that, when she's on planes. And we now are getting a bit of an old girls network. Apologies, Mary. I think you and I fall into that category, and it's our job to develop that network and help our junior colleagues advance. This has been talked about before in some of the context of academic activity, but you can see not just in academics, but in leadership in hospitals and hospital administration, you can see a fall off in terms of the percentage of women that are in the healthcare workforce. We form a great proportion of the worker level folks, but it falls off as you go to executive management. EQ or IQ, emotional intelligence, I think everyone is familiar with. This is kind of old news now. I do kind of like the cartoon here. I often find myself having my first reaction to be a little bit like hers, but it's about self-awareness, and it's managing yourself plus the situation around you. And we tend to be good at that, but it's not universal. It's also a skill that can be acquired and improved upon. And this is one that I think has been a challenge for me, and I think is a challenge for many women, which is self-promotion, gaining visibility, not allowing yourself to be invisible if you're the only woman in the room. These are practical tips. Lower your voice, use your power voice, walk confidently, amplify other women, gesture appropriately, find ways to be effective in your communication in environments where people aren't accustomed to hearing you talk. Be concise, I think, is another one that certainly I know I can improve on. It turns out there are a lot, when we think about building this pipeline, there are a lot of leadership opportunities for women now. Specifically, ELAM, I think, as was mentioned before, is an excellent program for specifically focused on women in academic medicine. I think they have an unstated goal of developing that dean pipeline. I'm not sure everybody wants to or needs to be a dean, but it is certainly set up to prepare you for one of those kind of leadership positions. But the American College of Surgeons, the AAMC, Harvard Medical Schools, through their business school, also has a variety of programs specific for physicians and then often some specific for surgeons. So I would encourage us to take advantage of these things to enhance the pipeline from the medical school level, where we're about half now, but to enhance that in terms of pediatric surgery. And finally, I thought I would just end with 3 quotes that I like, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions later. But one is from Eleanor Roosevelt, that the future belongs to those who believe in their dreams. I like the Dalai Lama, who I think is a wise man. The world will be saved by the Western woman. Very thought-provoking comment. There's a lot of world that needs to be saved right now. And finally, one of my favorites from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So thank you, Marion and APSA, for the opportunity to participate in this APSASode. And I will turn it back over to Marion for opening us up for some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Farmer. Dr. Perrone is going to lead the question session, and I'm going to pull up the slide.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Those were great presentations, very eye-opening. Even if we've seen it before, it's interesting to see them all juxtaposed together. So for all three of you, I have just an overall question, and we'll go in order of your presentations. But from the data, that clearly gender inequities still exist. And what would be your advice to us to try to lessen that gap? You know, for those of us who are rising up and trying to be leaders or be editors or just work the same or have the same block time as our male counterparts. What kind of ways do you see us moving forward in each of your domains? Dr. Kelleher first.
I think that the first step is really to recognize that it's not a personal fault or a personal failure that maybe what you've aspired to or what you've tried to do hasn't come to pass as quickly or as easily as you thought it should. Because I think a lot of us have been told or have sort of drunk the Kool-Aid, and we're all pretty isolated. And so we think that it actually has something to do with our own drive or our own ability to accomplish things. And I think that what the data shows is that that's really not the case, that it's really systemic, and it's really very, very widespread. It's not a fault of an individual, and that we're all working very hard. And sometimes our work just isn't applied in an equal fashion or counted in an equal fashion. I think that as individuals, it's important for us to ask for the things that we need and help our leadership to understand what those things are. So, you know, ask about block time, ask about referral patterns, ask to examine them, or have somebody, you know, ask your office manager or your administrator to examine them for you, because I think unless we look, we don't know. Like, we've always sort of had these anecdotes and assumptions, but really there's not been a lot of data to really support them. And I think that finding that data is the ground that we stand on, you know, the truth. And then I think it's going to come down to all of us coming together and saying, I demand and deserve the same PA support, the same admin support in my clinic, the same number of clinic hours, the same OR block time, and the same referrals as my male colleagues. And I stood up at Grand Rounds at MGH and said these things. And I can tell you that almost every woman came up to me afterwards and said, like, wow, I feel that and I believe it. And very few men actually came up and were happy to have heard it. So it's going to take time. It's going to take a change in our norms and our expectations of our society and ourselves. And we've all sort of lived that. And the next generation is going to, I mean, like our generation, I guess. I feel like I'm in between generations. We're really going to have to change the way we see ourselves and change the way other people see us. We can't expect ourselves to be men. I don't want to be a man. I want to have the opportunity to do what I want in a fair way. And it may look different than it has for a really long time. And I think bringing people along on that journey is a place we need to go. If I could have one more second, one really solid thing I think that we should ask our surgical leaders to do is really implement a sponsorship system so that the male surgeons and the older generation of surgeons who are really doing the really high complexity cases and really getting those referrals have a mandatory sponsorship system so that they have to start to share those things. You can't expect somebody to ever give them up willingly. Like, I don't want to give up my TEFs and my CDHs, but I am very happy to bring my junior colleagues in to do them with me. And then when one comes to them, to tell the next person that they're capable. And I think that should be an expectation, and it should be measured and followed, and not just allowed for individuals to decide if they want to or not, because nobody really wants to. So we have to demand it.
That's a great point. Dr. Fallett?
Yeah, so I guess my messaging around editorial boards and research and committees and things that require some work are to sign up, to show up, to get involved. If you sign up, you need to do the work and you need to get it done on time and meet the deadlines. And then close the loop. Align yourself with somebody who's going to push you a little, but always help people to understand the return on investment that they made in you. Thank them. Do the same for somebody else. And one of my mottos has always been to be quietly effective. I think if you do all these things, that people will notice. And they will especially notice if you're a closer. If you sign up, you show up, you do the work, it's good work, it's on time, it's delivered neatly and effectively, that those things make a difference. And when it comes down to disparities, I think ultimately we have to also put forth the same effort that men have done in the past, and show our worth in that we can do this also. And I think our time has come, but we also have to do all of those things that I've talked about because they're important, and that's how you get noticed.
I'd like to add that Mary absolutely has that reputation nationally in almost any environment you go into. She is known as, give the job to Mary Fallett and it will get done on time or ahead of schedule, and be of excellent quality. And I think that you're right, Mary, that has really served you well. And I hear that in many different environments. I would say, first of all, I'm not nearly as efficient and effective as Mary. I aspire to that as a role model. So for all of you who feel like you feel the same way, I want you to know you're not alone. I will say that I remember very clearly, I was at an early APSA education committee meeting. I was, I think, new on that group. And at that time, the APSA president would go around and sit in on some of the committee meetings because they would occur at the meeting. And someone I had never met before, who was APSA president at the time, sort of later came up to me and asked me who I was, because he had taken notice of the fact that I was contributing, I was making suggestions, that I was engaged in what was going on. And I think that actually helped me advance in that area. So I completely agree with Mary's comment that show up, be engaged, do the work.
Great. So Dr. Farmer, I have two questions for you. One, what is an executive summary that came up with something?
Great question. Didn't know, no one didn't know about that until I was asked. If you are applying for a job that is different from just being promoted, not that I don't mean just, but from assistant to associate to full professor, an executive summary is usually a 1 or 2 page summary of your work experience and what you've brought to the table in that work experience. So I would, for me, say I'm the head of a department that has, 70 faculty. Over the course of X years, I've brought the NIH ranking from X to Y. I've increased the recruitment. I've increased the number of faculty from A to Z. I have managed a budget of X amount. So it describes what you do and what you've brought to the work table in a different way. And you tend to tailor them for each job you might be looking at. But certainly when I went from division chief to department chair, I was able to talk about the contributions I had made in my role as division chief or surgeon in chief at UCSF, and demonstrating that I had this skill set that I could bring to the next job. So it really is a description of skills more than just your publications. So two different kinds of ways to describe yourself. And I think once you're looking at either division chief jobs or other leadership jobs, surgeon-in-chief jobs, having that will be useful. That actually goes to executive coaching, which I had no line of sight on really until I was in my chair position. But certainly I think if people are looking to either be surgeon-in-chiefs of their hospital, one might investigate in engaging a coach to help you form, for example, an executive statement, an executive summary.
Okay, great. Thank you. I had not heard of one before. Last question for you. So your pipeline talk was great, and it showed that we have equivalent number of female trainees right now. So have we arrived? Do we even need talks like this?
Really, really good question. I think this is complicated. I would say I'm thrilled that we have similar number of women residents in pediatric surgery now. I think the next step is having the kind of equity that Dr. Kelleher is talking about, making sure that women are getting the good cases, not just the appendectomies, making sure that we're getting the opportunities, whether it's in research or administration or other activities, ways to have impact in your community and your environment. That I think is harder. My experience has been that the higher up you go, the thicker the ceiling gets. But it doesn't mean it's that journey is not worth it. And I think all of those who have gone before us have made it a little easier. And I think that's the job of senior folks like myself now, is to help sponsor and pave the way for others. The number one skill is being an excellent surgeon and an excellent doctor. You can't, and I do think that we almost have to try harder, that just getting in the door of being a pediatric surgeon isn't enough. You have to be a really darn good surgeon. And in the early parts of your career, that's the most important job, is to make sure you can stand toe to toe and do the tough cases and have those experiences. And even if you are not doing the case, so again, advice I give junior folks, but one of your partners is doing a great case, you don't need to go watch them do appies, but participate, show up, learn the tricks of the trade. There are too many pediatric surgeons for the number of index cases that we have today. In my opinion, that's controversial. But therefore, it is incumbent on each of us, each of you, to take advantage of learning all those index cases. You don't need to do the sewing and cutting, because you know how to do that. It's the thinking and the operative management and what to do in a crisis that are important.
Thank you. And I think the final question is for Dr. Fallett, because I saw Dr. Kelleher was actually questioning Dr. Fallett. So must be other people have the same question, is what should we do to ask for editorial positions? Do we just ask? Do we ask somebody to ask for us? How should we navigate that?
I think you can do either, but look at your own track record. Do you turn your editorial assignments in on time? Are they quality assignments? Because many of these editors-in-chief have some type of grading assessment, and they actually critically look at the reviews that you turn in. So pick the subject that you're most interested in, inquire how you would get to be on an editorial board and say that you're interested. And if you can, look at the number. Most of them have a little record for you of the number of reviews that you've done. So you can look at that and you can quote that when you ask to be considered. And if you know somebody who's actually on the editorial board, you can ask them to vouch for you. But I think any and all of those are important things to do. And if you don't ask, you won't know if they would have considered you. So, don't feel that you're inferior to anybody else. What you should do is just ask the editor how you would be considered.
Yeah, I agree with Mary, and I would say, tell them have a focus. Say, hey, I really know a lot about X. I'd be delighted to help you out if you have papers that need to be reviewed in this topic. And then you demonstrate your performance, as Mary described, and they'll test you the first couple of times, and then they'll broaden the assignments that they might give you. I will say, be careful what you wish for. This can be a gigantic time sink, and the value, once you've become, it helps in promotion for sure. After that, I think it's okay to start narrowing back down what you might want to read about and contribute to.
I think that's great advice. Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for your time. This was very eye-opening and great work. And I know it took a long time to put together. So we really appreciate it from the Benjy Books Committee. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the
Thanks.
opportunity.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you for putting this together. Take care.
Good night.
Hi, good evening. Welcome everybody who made it. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm Erin Perrone. I work at the University of Michigan, and I've had the honor of serving as vice chair and now chair of the Benjy Books Committee since its inception a couple years ago. And next I will introduce Dr. Marion Henry, who has served as the chair.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here with us tonight. I'm Marion Henry from the University of Chicago, and the most recent past chair of the Benjy Books Committee. And now I will pass it to Dr. Kelleher.
I'm having a little trouble with network speed, but my name is Casey Kelleher. I'm a pediatric surgeon at Mass General.
And Dr. Fallett.
Let's see, can you hear me?
And
okay?
Dr. Fallett.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, Mary Fallett from Louisville. Can you hear me?
And
okay?
Dr. Fallett.
So thanks so much everyone for calling in tonight or
Yeah, we can
coming
hear
in.
you now.
Okay,
The
Mary
reminder
Fallett.
that you can put any questions you may have for the speakers in the chat, and we'll certainly ask them for you. We did have a very nice comment or that I'm hoping Dr. Kelleher and Dr. Fallett could just comment on from Dr. Statter. She says, thank you for the talks. When being interviewed or being considered for a position, do not be deterred by the statement that you may lack experience, and don't apologize for that, but state your potential. Could you guys give us some examples of a way that may work?
I guess I can say something similar to what I said during the earlier questions or the earlier part of the talk, in that I think that many of us have this idea that we struggle alone and that other women or other people don't have similar struggles to what we do. But the reality is that I think we all have potential by the example of where we have gotten to in this part of our lives. Like, we're all pediatric surgeons. We've all been to medical school. We all have a highly educated, and we all have a lot of skills and experience that we bring to the table. And I think that what she's trying to tell us is that we shouldn't say that just because we've never had a specific leadership position before or been on an editorial before, that that we don't have skills to bring to that position, and that we should highlight our skills rather than saying, well, I've never done this before, but I think I would do a good job. You could say, like, I have done these other things, and this is why I'm well positioned to do those things. I think we should remember that we all have shiny bits in our arsenal that we should show, and we don't have to display all of the reasons that we're not good for something.
For both you, Dr. Kelleher, and for you, Dr. Fallett, what are ways that leaders in our organizations, or for those who are in leadership positions, what are systematic ways that we can overcome some of these inequities and start to break down the barriers and implement greater equitable divisions?
Do you want to answer first, Dr. Fallon? I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Can you hear me,
Do you want to
Mary?
answer first, Dr. Fallon? I don't want to dominate the conversation.
I'm having a little bit of trouble with background noise. Can you hear me? Can you hear me,
Do you want to
Mary?
answer first, Dr. Fallon? I don't want to dominate.
Dr. Fallon, I think you're on a delay. Watching the other one, if you turn that one off, it may be easier.
Dr. Fallon, you just talk over me when you get, oh, she disappeared. Well, I guess that I'll tell you a few things that I think. The first thing I think is that we have to really understand what we're working with. And I think one of the things that we've never done really well is to identify where there's inequities. We haven't really measured things that are at the base level of what we're doing. So we have an idea that women aren't promoted as quickly, and maybe we don't get as much money for NIH grants, but we don't really understand the things that we do every day that might be leading to those end results. And I think that so we know the 10,000 level view, but we don't really know what's happening every day to put us into that place. And so I think that one of the things that we can ask our leadership to do is really take a hard look at what we're doing every day, and take a hard look at the actual data and metrics. So one thing that the Department of Medicine chief did when she came to Mass General a few years ago was she looked at everybody's FTE allotments, what their salary was, and what the breakdown of their salary reimbursement was. And she found that they're just even on a level of day-to-day work, people were getting paid very differently for the things they did. And it was just easy. All she had to do was look. Like, she didn't have to do anything very difficult. She just had to actually look at those things. And so I think that one thing that's easy to do, it's not asking for big changes. It's just asking for transparency, because I don't think we've never really looked before. And that's an easy thing to do, is say, like, let's be very transparent about what's happening. OR time, clinic help, how many how many things you expect me to do that are not remunerated, like committee work or, going to, give presentations to the medical students, those kind of things. I think we'd find that there's inequities that we can sort of balance out on a level without being disruptive to people's lives or the livelihoods that they built for themselves, which is the thing that really is going to take chipping away at, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that part of this is just seeing what's out there. I mean, a lot of us kind of work in our own silos and we don't necessarily know what our partners do or whatnot. And, when we start looking at it, though, I don't think anybody's excited that there's inequities. Nobody goes out trying to make that be the case. But once we recognize that they're there, we can then work to change that. And we also need to, coach ourselves and coach our colleagues, to relook at things and maybe, figure out ways that they can have some more balance in their life. So I think that was good.
I think it's important to point out as well that even if you're in a system that, doesn't reimburse or measure, look at RVUs separately amongst surgeons within a division, it still matters because it's still overall job satisfaction of what you're doing. And so if there are inequities, even if it's not affecting your salary reimbursement, and, where I came from, that was, it was RVUs were looked at a division-wide level, but not at an individual level. And so you'd think, oh, it doesn't matter. But it does matter because people still want to do, they still want equal opportunity to do the big cases, the ones that do generate those RVUs and get the same case, referrals and stuff. So I think that it does matter, even if it doesn't matter for compensation purposes, to really take a hard look at all of these inequities that might be there. And you're right, it is about just looking, because I think people don't look, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, I mean, I recently looked at like just numbers of clinics, and I was like, well, why does this surgeon have twice as much clinic time as these two surgeons? And what, that's not going to work out very well. We've got to fix that. So I do think it's important just to take a quick look at these things.
I think some of these things also feed into some of those end metrics that we've identified for a long time, like promotion, because in most academic institutions, you get promoted based on your niche, your expertise at something. And so if you're doing like a very large volume of very uninteresting cases, like you're doing all of the inguinal hernias, it's really hard to make your research niche inguinal hernias. Like you're not going to write a lot of papers about that, and no one's going to invite you to speak about that. And you're definitely not going to an international conference to be the hernia expert. And so I think it really does actually feed up into a lot of these other things that have been measured in the past that, I can do, way more cases than my colleagues, but if I'm doing, 1,000 appendectomies a year, it's really not helping me get anywhere. It's, just making me work really hard and, like you said, not enjoy my job so much. I could talk about this for hours.
Absolutely. Well, I think that we don't probably have hours that we can continue to discuss, although I agree with you there. And Dr. Follett had technical challenges, so she apologizes for having to drop off the live feed. But Erin, I'll turn it to you for closure.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I think, like we said, just starting to understand things and unpeel the layers of the onion is really what we need to do. And I really thank all of our speakers. They did a lot of work to give us this information. And I think it's the rest of our jobs to then take it and, and make changes and make sure that we look at our own places and with our mentors and mentees and learn the new skills that we got here today and move forward. And we thank everybody for coming and listening, and look forward to future events with Benjy Brooks. Good night.